So far in this series, I've offered some of my viewpoints on how we should understand the events surrounding Noah and Ham's fallout, Abraham's claim to Abimelech that Sarah was his sister, and I gave an episode over my views on moral ontology and the nature of God's goodness, being pure, perfect, holy, eternal, and universally applicable, which stands in opposition to claims of divine command theory. Divine command theory says that God's commands are good solely because God commands them, which I think necessarily implies that God's goodness is ad hoc, arbitrary, and duplicitous. It also is a dangerous theory since it's unfalsifiable to the ones who embrace it, meaning it would be impossible for holders of divine command theory to exercise their own judgment and reason on if a command they receive is actually good or evil. All they need to do is to be convinced that it came from God, and that command told them to do something, and then that command could tell them to do just about anything, and they would become a danger to society in the worst case, or have an existential crisis in the best case. Let me give you what I mean. Let me put this on full display here in this clip by Frank Turek when he's confronted with this scenario.
Dr. Turek, God commanded you to murder your wife or children to prove your faith in God. Is your current devotion not enough to prove your faith? Must you murder your children as Abraham was instructed?
First of all, I don't know what I would do.
This is a simple yes or no question, Doc.
I don't know what I would do in Abraham's position. That's a good question. You know who really struggled with that? Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote a book called...
Is your faith strong enough to murder your own children or wife?
I'm thinking, and since I'm from New Jersey, it's really hard for me to do, so give me a minute. The book is called Fear and Trembling by Soren Kierkegaard. So I don't know what I would do, just like I'm never going to say if somebody put a gun to my head or a gun to my wife's head, what would you do? Because Peter tried that. I'll never deny you, Lord. And what did he do?
He denied him 3 times. Yes, at the crucifixion.
I don't know what I would do, okay? But let me point out, if your friend is an atheist, there's nothing wrong with God doing anything because by atheism, there's no standard of right and wrong anyway. So in order for you to bring up the objection, you're actually stealing a standard from God in order to try and say God doesn't exist.
Dr. Turek, I'm only asking if you would murder your wife or children to prove your devotion. It's a simple question.
I don't know what would happen. And by the way, when God decides that someone should die, it's not murder for him. Because God kills all of us at some point. And he's the only one that can resurrect us. So we don't have the right to murder people, but God has the right to kill people anytime he wants. He can strike me down today, tomorrow, anytime he wants, and it's completely in his prerogative.
Here's another clip of Alex O'Connor doing a similar test on Dr. McLatchie, asking him if he'd be a participant in commands from God that go against his moral conscience.
I also think, in terms of killing innocent people, I think it's difficult to make moral judgments on an omniscient being who has access to things that can happen in the future as consequences.
If your conception of justice is based in God, then you can at least imagine a scenario in which God asks you to do something which goes against what you originally believed to be his moral character. Right. You could be, I mean, you surely must admit that you could be wrong about your conception of what justice is and what God's goodness really means. And what I'm asking you is that if God commanded you to do something which contradicts your understanding of good, but you know must be in line with God's understanding of good, would you do it?
So I don't answer hypothetical questions like that.
I think a better reason to not answer that question is because whichever way you answer it, it demonstrates something wrong with the position that you're holding.
Okay, elaborate on why you say that.
If you say that you would, then it demonstrates that a religion like Christianity can drive people to do some fairly immoral things, and I doubt that you would say that you would do that. But if you say that you wouldn't, then you claim that there's some kind of moral standard that exists outside of God. It's a different story, though, because, of course, God didn't actually want Abraham to sacrifice his son. He just wanted to show his willingness to do so.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if you had children, what would you do in his position?
So I don't believe that God, it would be consistent with God's character.
Well, let me put it simply. I'd say no.
Mm-hmm. So I don't answer hypothetical questions of that nature.
Neither Frank Turek nor McLatchie answered the question. They dance and dodge around the question altogether, which is it's an unfair cop-out, because if they were truly going to be consistent in their theology and their moral ontology, their ethic, they'd have to say, yes, they do all those heinous things because divine command theory tells them to. This is why it's important to understand this topic of moral ontology, and on top of that, to understand what the morality of God is in the Bible, so that we can do exactly as the New Testament calls us as Christians to do, which is to exercise prudence and judgment and to distinguish between good and evil. A divine command theory approach casts that responsibility to the gutter irresponsibly, in my opinion. And when atheists like O'Connor point that out to the divine command theorists, I think it's a death blow to their entire ethic. If those hypothetical questions were posed to me, I'd refer you to my Warfare, Violence, and Biblical Law series, where I dive deeply into that topic. And as far as the question from Cody in the Frank Turek video about if I would sacrifice my own son to appease God if God commanded me to do that, I could easily, and with no inconsistency or violation of my conscience, say, no, I would not do that. Because if that command ever did find me, I would immediately know such a command was not from God, but from the devil in disguise. Because my biblical ethic and theology tells me that Abraham's son was a foreshadow of Jesus' sacrifice that God, in the final analysis, did not really intend to let Abraham go through with, and that Jesus Christ has already fulfilled the requirement of that blood sacrifice, so that for anyone to offer any more blood sacrifice would be a rejection of Jesus Christ's work, and God would not reject his own gospel and contradict himself. For Frank Turek, on the other hand, with his divine command theory, they are left in a troubled position, because instead of testing a command to see if it is from God or not, their moral framework doesn't allow them to have any criteria by which to test if a command is from God or not, if it is good or if it's not, because their base metric on if anything is good or not is if it's from God. But how would they know if something is from God? They can't. Okay, that's opening up a whole new can of worms, and I could talk about that a whole lot more, but I was just whetting your beak so you could see my approach to the issue of this episode about Adam and Eve's children and who they married. Did Cain and or Abel marry their sisters?
Who did Cain marry?
Cain married his sister. Who else could he possibly marry but his sister?
Now follow along with me very carefully as I lay out my reasoning, because it's very important you understand my thought process in order to see why I land where I land on this issue. You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again. We need to pay strict attention to what the Bible says and what the Bible does not say. Does the Bible say that Cain or Abel married their sisters? The answer is no, it does not say that. Nowhere in Scripture is that stated at all. So from the get-go, any claim that Cain or Abel, I'll just refer to Cain from now on to simplify this, any claim that Cain married his sister is pure speculation. And out of all the speculations that you can make, to choose the one speculation that God forced incest onto his own people is bizarre and strange to me. How does anyone have any intellectual satisfaction in saying that God forcing incest onto Cain and Abel gives us clarity to this situation at all? Such speculation creates a God that gives contradictory commands, in my opinion, so I reject it. Now, the most common response I get to pointing out this fact is always the same. Like clockwork, predictable and cliche, it's always the same question. It's, well, who else would they have married? And I'm a little annoyed at this question for several reasons. First of all, asking a question isn't an argument. You aren't buttressing your position with more evidence by asking that question. So the fact that people consistently ask it as if it's evidence for their position annoys me, because they are trying to frame the discussion in a very dishonest way. Because asking me that question isn't evidence of anything. Now, what they probably mean to say when they ask that is, there was nobody else to marry besides their sisters. That's probably what they mean to say. But you see, that's the very assumption they are making. That's not evidence either. It's just more speculation on top of speculation. Can they prove that there was nobody else? Can they show in Scripture how there was nobody else besides Cain's sisters? Does the Bible actually say that? No, it does not. So again, we're just back to the same square we started with when the claim of incest was conjectured. Now, the other reason I'm annoyed at this question is because I don't have an answer. I don't have to have an answer to it in order for my position to have validity. I have my own speculations, but instead of just throwing speculations around, I just point out that the Bible simply does not outright say who Cain married. And because the Bible is silent on who exactly was the wife of Cain or Abel, but the Bible is not silent on the matter of God hating incest in Leviticus 18, that's more than enough to give me the faith that somehow, some way, God provided so that Cain and Abel did not have to be forced into incest at God's own hand. And that's it. It's simple. It's consistent. It relies on the text, and it doesn't add to the text. Now, of course, my critics are upset with that answer, and so they will continue to push and repeat themselves, saying, who else would they have married? And it begins to be made clear that what they are actually doing is inviting me to speculate so that they can punish me for speculating later. And I understand that desire to speculate, trust me, because any Christian would be curious to know the details about how God works out his means in people's lives, especially in areas where we don't see it explicitly written out. But then to get upset because I simply obliged their request is just debating in bad faith. Now, I'm willing to engage in speculation, so long as my listeners and my critics understand that that is all I'm doing. It's just speculation. I'm not saying I know with certainty how God provided. I'm only giving one possible explanation out of a mystery of choices that could have happened. So as long as that's understood, we can go down this road carefully. Now, in my opinion, we already have an example from Scripture about how God provided a wife to a man that had no other means for procreation, speaking of Adam. So it's not far-fetched at all, I think, to say that God provided to the sons of Adam and Eve wives by the exact same means that God provided a wife to Adam. Now, as soon as I say that, like clockwork, my critics cry out, the Bible doesn't say that. That isn't written anywhere. And this is why that original question of who else would they have married annoys me so much, because I see it as a dishonest setup, a bait and switch. Of course the Bible doesn't say that's how it happened. The Bible doesn't say what happened, so we don't know. And I already pointed that out. But when I am invited by my critic to offer a speculation, it's bad faith discussion to then accuse me of things like adding to the text when that's not what I did at all, because I prefaced it by saying it's only a speculation. And I only engaged in that speculation because I was invited and solicited by that same critic to offer a speculation. So these same critics approach that I have seen multiple times when I offer this explanation is like clockwork. So then I say, hey, look, if you don't like speculation, then fine, let's not do it at all. But you were the one who speculated first when you said that Cain definitely married his sister. So if we're going to be taking speculations off the table altogether, I'm fine with that. Then stop saying that Cain married his sister, because that's not in the Bible either. And then, again, the retort is always, well, who else would he have married? And then we're back into the same abysmal circular reasoning path that the critic offers us. But there you have it. That's my belief. To recap it quickly again, the first layer of it is to see that God hates incest in Leviticus 18, and elsewhere God promises to not tempt anyone to sin, let alone force them into sin, and to see that if Cain and Abel married their sisters, it was because God forced them into incest. Since that's a contradiction, we reject, and since the Bible doesn't explicitly say who Cain and Abel married, it doesn't explicitly say they married their sisters. We are justified in having faith that God provided a way for them to procreate without engaging in incest, even if we don't know what the provision exactly was. Now, the second layer, after you set that foundation, the second layer to this is a mere speculation that God took from the ribs of the sons of Adam to form wives the same way God formed Eve. And I coined this theory, this speculative theory, with the title of the Cain rib theory. Now, I could be wrong about the theory, but I don't think I'm wrong about the faith that God provided in some way, even if it wasn't by the Cain rib theory. I feel a little bit like Abraham, when Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac, and Abraham was reasoning in his head how this was going to work out. He was probably thinking things like, is it good for God to command this? Am I good to carry it out? And the New Testament tells us that Abraham didn't know how God would provide, only that somehow, some way, he had the faith that God would provide. Abraham even began to speculate that God would possibly just bring Isaac back from the dead. If such a death blow would be made null so that God's goodness and provision could be maintained. Ultimately, Abraham's speculation wasn't correct since God stopped him from following through, all the way. But Abraham's faith that God would provide ultimately was proven correct and accurate. And here we are on the other side of the cross in the modern day and age, wondering how God handled this incest situation of Adam and Eve's family. And I'm over here like, is it good for God to force that on Cain and Abel? Is it good for Cain and Abel to engage in that? And here I am not knowing exactly how God would provide a way so as to avoid the sinfulness of incest, but still having faith that God definitely would provide some kind of way, even if I don't know what that way is. And I also do engage in some speculation about how God might provide, but ultimately, even if my specific speculation is wrong, it doesn't mean that my faith that God did provide was wrong. Now, I want to spend the rest of this video going over one alternative explanation I found about the incest in Adam's children, given by Pastor Douglas Wilson. And then in the next video, I want to go over a little more in depth on the Cain rib theory to see what the consequences of that theory are and what are the assumptions made in the theory so we can really hash out its viability. For now, let's hear Doug Wilson's take on Cain and Abel and incest.
That the prohibition against marriages of consanguinity, and every 8-year-old knows what that means, right? Were not immediately prohibited. The laws against intermarriage among relatives was a later prohibition that God brought to bear after the initial mandate of being fruitful and multiplying was reached a certain point. And we even know that today, that the problems associated with intermarriage do not begin to show up until several generations later as a constant problem. So Cain married his sister, okay?
You ready for some Levitical law?
Okay, I guess.
Ms. asks, how does Cain and Abel marrying their sister square with the law prohibiting sexual relations with a sibling and calling those things abominations?
Okay, it squares it with it very nicely.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So, and here's how. The first thing to observe is that the law prohibiting such unions did not exist in Cain and Abel's time. There was no law against it. Now, now there's a secondary debate that goes along with this, and I'll just touch on it without getting into it. But did God prohibit the things that He prohibited simply for moral or ceremonial reasons only, or were there also health benefits? Right. So I think that I'm on the side of the debate that says that avoiding unclean foods, observing the Levitical law where you had to make yourself clean by the use of soap made from the sacrificial animal, all of those things are things that would be conducive to health. And God says to the people of Israel, if you follow my law, I will visit upon you none of the diseases of Egypt. Okay? Now, one of the one of the things that we have discovered in genetics is that marrying your brother and sister, or even marrying your first cousin, is not a good long-term strategy. You might come up with some purebreds, but they're going to be purebreds that are neurotic or have. So the royal families of Europe did this experiment for you. How can we get some hemophilia going
in every major house in Europe? Yeah.
Right. So in close intermarriage is not a good idea. Okay.
Yeah. Does this apply to polygamy as well? With the prohibitions, or one man, one woman in the New Testament versus Abraham having multiple wives?
I think that I don't think that there's a health issue there that I'm aware of, but I think that it's a similar kind of thing. There are certain things that God introduced over time, and so basically, Adam and Eve had all the genetic material for all the races of humanity in them, right?
Yeah.
And so a marriage of Cain to his sister, or Seth to his sister, would not have had the genetic narrowness
Yeah.
that when you get out to the end and all you've got is Irish setters, right? You've got yourself a neurotic dog. So early on, I don't think there was that problem. Later on, it was a problem, and God put a taboo on it. God instituted a Mosaic taboo on that practice, and for which we're grateful.
So here, Doug Wilson offers the explanation that Cain and Abel definitely did marry their sisters, but it was okay because when laws like Leviticus 18 forbid it, it's only forbidding it because it's preventing the genetic diseases that result from such unions. Since Adam and Eve had enough genetic variety in their DNA to avoid the diseases associated with incest, it was okay for them. But it's bad for us because we are more vulnerable to such genetic diseases. Wilson calls the Leviticus 18 law a Mosaic taboo. Now, I give credit to Doug for sticking to the text and for also attempting to dig into the laws of God to try to understand what's the moral principle being communicated. But I still disagree with him. Doug is offering one legitimate interpretation of who Cain and Abel married, but it requires him to reinterpret the law of Leviticus 18 in an illegitimate way. If Doug Wilson thinks this law is simply a taboo and that it was only put in place to avoid genetic diseases, then in the modern age, with the advances we've seen in genetic engineering, it's very possible that someday in the future, a team of scientists would figure out a way to treat and remove such genetic disease from the offspring of incestuous unions. Let's say that happens. According to Doug Wilson's interpretation of Leviticus 18, there is no longer any reason why we should follow these prohibitions anymore. Douglas Wilson could no longer be against incest because he would have no ground to stand on in condemning incestuous marriages based on his interpretation of the law and his interpretation of Cain and Abel's marriages. I, on the other hand, think incest is wrong, whether genetic diseases play a factor or not. If science ever got to that advanced point of curing genetic diseases, Wilson would be acting inconsistently with his own stated moral beliefs if he continued to say incest is a sin. Do you think Doug Wilson would be consistent with his own interpretation? I don't think he would. I think Douglas Wilson would still know and teach that incest is wrong, even if genetic diseases were no longer a factor, because he sees deep down something inherently repulsive about incest, outside of guiding taboos to avoiding diseases. But he and others like him rely on the ostensible marriages between siblings in Adam's household as a basis for them trying to display that God's morality changes over time, even though the text never states that. So in the next video, I want to go in depth on the speculation that I offered of the Cain rib theory. So if you want to stay tuned for that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.